Vishavtem lovetach ba'artzachem, v'nosati shalom ba'oretz. Parshas Bechukotai promises us that eventually and ultimately you'll be able to live lovetach ba'artzachem, be able to live in total security and peace in the land without fear of any enemies at all. And then v'nosati shalom ba'oretz. And not only that, you'll have shalom ba'aretz. Say the Mefarshim, well, if you're lovetach, why do you need an additional promise of shalom? Says the Ibn Ezra one word. V'nosati shalom ba'aretz beinechem. There will be peace among you. In other words, part of the vision of Bechukotai. And Bechukotai gives us the ultimate vision of a utopian world. A world in which we can feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our midst, and we'll be able to walk with pride and with certainty, and there'll be prosperity, and there'll be abundance, and there'll be security. The most wonderful description, says the Rabbeinu Bachaye, it begins with an aleph, im Bechukotai telechu, and it ends with a taf of komemiyut. It's a bracha me aleph ad taf. It's a bracha from beginning to end, a total bracha, says Rabbeinu Bachaya and the Rambam, that actually this vision of Parshas Bechukotai is a vision of Achris Hayomim. It's a messianic vision. It's never ever happened in the past. But it's important to know that there is such a thing, that this will one day happen. It's important to know for two reasons. First of all, to live in hope, that we never give up hope, because we know there is such a promise that this will definitely happen one day. But apart from the hope, it's more than that. It's to tell us that the world in which we live, which is so disastrous in so many ways, and so difficult, and such an olam hapirud, a world of disaster, nevertheless, it contains within it bekoyach, potentially, if not yet bepoyal. But bekoyach, it contains within it the possibility of becoming the world that is described in the first 10 Pesukim of Parshas Bechukotai, and ultimately, Olech Eschem Kabamias. Rashi says, Kabamias, Komo Kufa, to walk upright with pride. But we borrow it, don't we? We borrow it in our Birkas Hamazon, Rachamon, Yishbar Uleinu Me'al Tzaborenu, Hu Yelichenu Komemius Latenu. When you say that next time, you've got to know that word and that posuk, that Harachamon, comes from Bechukotai, and we're borrowing it because it's the ultimate bracha, that we should be able to go Komemius, upright and proud, le'artzeinu, to our land. And I remember Rav Goren, he adapted that a little bit, and he said we should say in our Birkas Hamazon, v'hu yolichenu komemiyut be'artzeinu, not le'artzeinu, but be'artzeinu. We're in the land, and we should have komemiyut, we should have the pride and the certainty. Just by the way, I remember seeing the Chasam Sofer 200 years ago. The Chasam Sofer, he was against people who lived their lives in Chutz La'aretz and then wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. And they sent the mace to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. He didn't like that at all. So he said in a couple of his drashas, he said, if you want to go to Eretz Yisrael, you should go komemius, you should go vertical, not horizontal. That was his take on this particular pasuk. I'll call upon him, this vision that the Torah gives us of the best possible imaginable world is inspiring and uplifting and edifying. However, I'm reminded, Lahavdil Elef Havdalas, of the opening sentence in the novel of Charles Dickens, the famous British novelist of 200 years ago, a book that he wrote, The Tale of Two Cities, where he starts off by saying, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. This is a very, if you like, a literary way of describing the fact that we have, in a sense, or v'choshech be'erbuvia. We have at the same time two different, totally conflicting visions living in our minds, living in our society. And he captures that in this opening sentence and in his book. And I say facetiously maybe that he'd just been reading Parshas Bechukotai, because that's exactly what Parshas Bechukotai does. It starts off with these 10 pesukim of the most fabulous hope and inspiration, and then he goes into another 33 pesukim of the most chilling account of disaster, of despair, wave after wave of plague and poverty and defeat at the hand of our enemies. The most terrible, terrible exiles are being predicted in Parshas Bechukotai, so terrible, in fact, that we have the minhag to read it in an undertone. We don't even want to hear it. We can't even hear it. You can't even listen to it. It's so terrible. Right? But the Torah gives us this. Bechukotai is light and darkness. Right? And both are important. And the difference between the two is im bechukotai telechu. If Klal Yisrael choose to be faithful to emunah, faithful to chesed, faithful to the values of the Torah and mitzvahs, that is the algorithm. That's the key to unlock this state of the world. And if we abandon Judaism, and if we abandon Torah and mitzvahs, then the results will be disastrous. And that's the message of Bechukotai. Difficult though it is to really absorb completely, but that's the message. But there is a third level to this message, and that is after we've heard this most unbearable account of disaster and despair, the Torah says, "V'afgam zos." Nevertheless, even if the worst comes to the worst, there is a promise in Bechukotai, "Lo ma'astim v'lo ga'altim l'chalosam." Klal Yisrael will not be rejected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will not be destroyed, will not cease to exist. The covenant is immovable. The bris with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Zacharti as Barisi Yaakov. There is a covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu which is unbreakable, right? And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises us that we will indeed find our way back again. We'll go through terrible times, but we'll find our way back again. But along the way, we will endure all sorts of difficulties, and the reason is because we drift away from Torah and mitzvahs. But within the disasters, there are these psukim which are like an oasis in the desert, telling us of the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the unbreakable covenant. This coming week, we're celebrating the 28th of Iyar, the Yom Yerushalayim, the 58th anniversary of the reunification of Yerushalayim, the liberation of Yerushalayim, restoring Yerushalayim to Jewish sovereignty after 2,000 years. And I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that that was probably, in my lifetime certainly, the most miraculous event I could possibly ever have imagined. Of all the events that I've ever heard of in my lifetime, the events of 1967 were the most incredible Yad Hashem. If it was up to me, I'd make the bracha Shasanissim Lavaseinu B'Yom Mehem Bazman Hazeh. This was a total nace, right? Anybody who was around at the time, and if you read the accounts and see the footage, you will see that in the 3 or 4 weeks before the 6-Day War, Klal Yisrael were in Avelis. They were certain there was going to be another Holocaust. There was no way out of this, right? The nations, Egypt and Syria and Iraq and even Jordan a bit, were all threatening. Nasser had whipped up a frenzy. You see visions of tens of thousands of people in the street in Egypt, all shouting, Itbach al Yahud, we're going to slaughter all the Jews, and they're going to make a big yontif out of it, and we're going to wipe the place clean. And this is going to be the great achievement, their great achievement. And they were heavily armed with all sorts of good Russian hardware, and Israel was a small nation. Today we've got, 6 million Jews. Then we only had 2 million Jews there living in the country, and it was a very small nation. Medinat Yisrael wasn't yet 20 years old. And no single nation of the world stood up to defend us and to threaten the Arabs. If they did anything, they would suffer the consequences. It didn't happen. Klal Yisrael stood alone against immeasurable odds, and it was going to be a disaster. They were digging graves, thousands of graves, because they knew there was going to be a terrible price to pay. And then what happened? HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent us shalichim, sent us malachim, and within a few days it was all over. And the world was completely breathless. Who's ever heard of a war that ends in 6 days? No one's ever heard of it in the history of warfare. Who's ever heard of Yerushalayim being restored to Jewish sovereignty after 2,000 years? It was completely unimaginable and incredible, in the real sense of the word, incredible. And Yehuda and Shamran were restored to us, and the depth of that nace was something incredible. So we also live in a world where there is light and darkness together. The events of the 7th of October put us into a period of darkness, which we're still in to a certain extent. We can still feel that darkness. But when we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim, we have to remember the moments that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us light and gave us hashgacha pratis and fulfilled that promise. Lo ma'astin lo ga'altim l'chalosam. Despite whatever happens, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, and this is the great promise of Parshas Bechukotai. In Bechukotai Teilechu, so the Ibn Ezra says it means Bechukotai Teilechu means to learn Torah, right? Mitzvosai Tishmeru means to teach Torah, right? V'asisem osam means to act accordingly. So the learning and the teaching and the acting accordingly, that is the package. It's not complicated. It just needs focus, it needs emunah, it needs a sense of destiny, and that's really the Bechukotai Teilechu. Says as far as emes, these are the three categories of the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama, to dedicate ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with our neshama, with our thoughts, with our nefesh, with our heart and our passions, and with our guf, with our actions. All three need to be focused on our life of emunah and of Torah, and in that way we can unlock this amazing world, the world that is promised in Parshas Bechukotai. And Yehirotzen that indeed we should be zeicher v'olech eschem komamius, to taste that komamius, to taste that sense of pride and certainty for us and for our children. V'chein Yehirotzen.